Kurt Nelson, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
I am very excited to be here. Thank you, John.
Wonderful. It's great to have you joining us, and I'm excited to tap into your expertise as it relates to motivation and helping organizations be successful and helping leaders tap into the potential of their employees. Kurt Nelson, PhD, is founder and senior behavioral scientist. He is a sought-after consultant, speaker, and recognized leader in the human motivation and behavior change space. For over 20 years, Kurt has worked with global companies to apply behavioral science principles to drive change in their organizations. He is founder and president of the Lantern Group, a behavioral change and communication agency. He is also co-founder with Tim Houlihan of Behavioral Grooves podcast, where they interview leading academic and business executives from around the world and explore how they apply behavioral science to their work and their lives. All his work focuses on understanding ways to positively influence how people behave. Kurt has his MBA from the University of Iowa and his PhD in industrial and organizational psychology from Capella University. So again, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I am excited to be here. Very
And
excited.
before we launch into our topics for today, is there anything else you would like to add in terms of your background or general overview for the listeners?
No, I consider myself a behavioral scientist, basically trying to understand why people do what they do. And I think the more that we can understand that, the better we are at being able to work with other people and to have a very positive working as well as personal relationships with them.
Excellent. And uh, my background, of course, is dual in terms of, I consider myself a scholar practitioner. I'm a professor on the one hand, I'm a consultant on the other hand. And my PhD is actually in sociology, even though I teach in a business school and in the organizational leadership department. So I love that you specifically talk about behavioral science explicitly,
Yeah.
in how you approach attacking organizational challenges. And IO Psych is such an interesting area and so incredibly important and relevant for organizations. And I teach a lot of organizational development at the university. And one of the things I repeatedly tell the students is that organizational development and all of these kind of interrelated fields, they're all inherently interdisciplinary and tying in all the different behavioral science disciplines to better understand processes, people, and all the interactions that occur. So anyways, I love that you frame yourself as a behavioral science expert and someone who can help organizations think through things that way, not just, a business consultant, a leadership consultant.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a really interesting part, right? And I think in business, one of the things that we often miss is this idea of tapping into some of the sciences of understanding humans and human motivation and human behavior. And the thing I like about behavioral science, as you said, it's this cross-disciplinary component. It isn't just sociology. It isn't just psychology. It is this intermix between all of these facets where economics to neuroscience to anthropology to
Yep.
all of those facets that bring it together. And that's where you can see some of the power behind this, because you're getting all these different perspectives, and businesses that are able to take that insight and take insights from all of those, I think tend to operate better because they just have that better understanding of, as we often say, our most valuable asset is our people. And the better you can understand that valuable asset, the better that you're going to be able to perform.
Yeah, and I think having the multiple perspectives, the different frameworks can be really beneficial because there's no, at least I've never come across a theory of everything that actually explains everything, right? And so you get little pieces of explanation through different models and through different theories, and each kind of has their strengths and their weaknesses. And so I just see it as like extending your toolkit.
Yeah.
So you have more ways of understanding the world generally, but organizations more specifically. And so I love that. And I'm also a big proponent just of of multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity generally. I think that's important for leaders to be able to think in different ways. And I also consider systems thinking to be vital for successful organizations. And I just don't think you can be a true systems thinker unless you're able to consider these various types of vastly different, in some cases, disciplines. Like you mentioned, I mean, neuroscience is
Yeah.
really important. Now, psychology, sociology, there's a lot of overlap. Anthropology, you get some of these different ones that they're distinct, but they also have a lot of overlap. But then you have like neuroscience. It's vital, and unless we're looking, and data science and these various areas, we just have to consider in conjunction with each other.
Yeah, I mean, you look at how complex we are as humans. The complexity of how our brain works and why we do what we do, and by saying that, oh no, psychology has the be all end all solution to what that is, I think is just a little bit foolhardy, given the fact that you have all these disciplines that are exploring it from a different lens. They're looking at things from a different perspective, and so if you can meld those together, take the best pieces of them, and then that gives you a different insight. So you mentioned anthropology, and then I also bring in economics, right? You think about economics, and we do a lot of things because of the economic drives and incentives that we are driven by. But if you just looked at economics, we would be these rational actors. If the standard economic model, if you went to that, not behavioral economics, but we'd be these rational actors who, don't behave anyway like we see going on in the world, and yet that's the way that they look at it. Yet that informs us, right? It gives us some aspect of truth that's out there, and then you meld that with psychology and you meld it with sociology, and all of a sudden you get a much richer, more holistic perspective of why people are doing what they're doing.
So how do you make the pitch to organizational leaders to think about things, from a behavioral science perspective?
I talk about this idea of, uh, if you could understand your employees or understand your customers or your clients better, would that help you in being able to be a better leader? And for the most part, people say, yes, of course that would. If I could understand why John down in accounting does this that always makes me mad, or how can I copy, Florence, who's out on the sales, shop and is doing all of those things. What about her that makes her so successful? Well, if we can understand some of those assets, some of the facets that make them behave and do and think the way they do, then you can hopefully try to start replicating those positive things and taking some of those negative things and putting systems and putting processes in place in order to reduce that friction. So that's the tale that I try to tell, and most organizational leaders get that. And then it just comes down to, is behavioral science the best way of doing that? And in my opinion, I think it is. So
Yeah, it's interesting. Some people really, in my experience, resonate around the idea of a behavioral science framing. Other people are resistant to it. I suppose it just depends ultimately on the individuals that you're working with. Um, and I think it's always important, whenever we're working with business leaders, to help make the business case for them so they understand why what we're trying to do will matter in terms that resonate right with them, and that they understand. And so whether we use the business or the behavioral science terminology specifically, or we just use those concepts kind of a little bit more deviously, right, without telling them about it, ultimately it can drive the same types of outcomes. But I'm with you. I think whenever possible, just be completely transparent about, hey, this is the value that will that you can have through this kind of an approach. And it's important to add that business is one of those behavioral science areas that will inform what we're doing. It's just not the only framing.
yeah. Oh,
So it's
and
important.
I think you bring up a very good point. So senior leadership, I can talk about, people and why science around understanding people is good. At the end of the day, if it doesn't increase performance, if it doesn't lend itself to the issues that senior leadership are dealing with, they could care less if they understand why somebody does something. That doesn't, it usually doesn't enter into their thinking process. That being said, if you can show them how the making a better judgment case of why people are doing what they're doing, I keep going back to that statement, and how that impacts the bottom line, how that impacts their customer satisfaction, how it increases employee engagement, all those factors that they're looking at, then that case gets sold by itself. So that's, you bring up a really good point. You have to put it into their language, and I talk about communication a lot, and the way that we communicate with our employees or with our customers is important. It's also important for us to be able to, as practitioners of this, right, to be able to communicate effectively with the senior leaders that we're trying to convince, in order to say this is a valuable piece, a valuable tool that you can add to your tool collection.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's great. So let's talk a little bit more about motivation, motivating employees. And I guess that's a little bit of a trap, because I'm a believer that you can't really motivate anybody to do anything that they don't want to do, but you can set the stage, and you can help create the environment in which people will find meaning and purpose, and then motivate themselves, right?
Yeah, and organizations. So I do a lot of work with companies around their incentive programs, their sales incentives in particular, but total rewards programs, recognition, all those facets. And I think one of the things that companies do is they focus in on extrinsic motivators, to the detriment sometimes of many of the intrinsic pieces that you were just talking about. And so I would disagree. I think you can actually get people to do things because you're paying them to do them, but will that be sustainable? Is it the best way of getting them? Are they
Yeah.
fully engaged in there?
Eh,
Probably not.
yeah, and
Yeah.
to that point, I agree too. I think in the short term, you can pull a lot of carrot and stick levers to get people to comply with what you want them to do.
Exactly.
The problem is that you won't attract and retain the best people in the long term if that's your approach.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so if
You,
you only focus, I mean, and I by no means am I do I want to suggest that we shouldn't pay people fairly, that we shouldn't have a safe work environment. All those things are also super important, but they're kind of baseline, right? You need to do those things to treat people fairly, and then take them off the table. But it's those other things that tend to be the more sustainable types of long-term motivators.
Well, and I think organizations, again, I talked about economics before and the standard rational economic model. And I think too many organizations are looking at motivating people through that lens, looking at, if I just pay people more, they will go above and beyond and do the things that we need them to do. And to a certain degree, there's some validity in that. You can see it. You can put out a 90-day incentive, offer people $1,000 to go do it, and you will see an uptick in that level of performance. To your point, you take that $1,000 away next time, does that behavior stick? Probably not, right? The fact of the matter is you need to be able to understand what are the motivations for people. Why are they doing what they're doing? And I also always talk about incentives, in particular, as their signals for people. We interpret, if the company is putting enough focus on this to pay me to do this specific thing, it must be really important for the company. And so it's a communication tool as much as it is a motivational tool. And then you look in and you look at the research that shows what are some of the things that actually motivate, and praise and thank yous and recognition, feed our self-confidence, feed our autonomy, variety of other internal things. And so those are really important to do. And then if you're actually looking at extrinsic motivators, right? Cash is wonderful, but sometimes it's better to use things that are non-cash, whether it be a trip or merchandise or other factors that go into this, because they're the way that we process cash and money in our brains is very different than how we process other things. There's this hedonic treadmill and motivation, and the way that we group money. Richard Thaler talks about, whenever we get money, we put it into certain money buckets. We have the money for our food, we have the health insurance, we have our retirement account. And so you get an incentive of a couple $1,000s, and all of a sudden it gets parceled into these mental accounting categories that we have, and we feel guilty about spending them on actual hedonic type luxury things, which are the things that actually motivate us, because we like to go on trips and we like to spend time with our family and, have a barbecue out in the back or play golf or whatever it is that we're doing, that these merchandise or trip things that can do. And so if you offer those, and again, you have to be smart about this, it's not just putting things out. You can waylay some of that guilt that comes with it, and at a subconscious level it actually drives us more powerfully. And there's been really some good research that shows, hey, offer an equivalent cash versus this other tangible type thing, and people will always prefer the cash. They'll say, give me the cash. There's a say do gap there. But then when you actually look at the performance at the end of the day, the non-cash stuff does better. And actually, when you put recognition and some of those intrinsic motivators in there, you really make it. And so you need to have a holistic approach from my perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that it certainly holds true for me. I think about cash bonuses that I've received in the past, and they just end up in my bank account. And I,
Yeah,
I'm a frugal guy, so
yeah,
I don't always like spending money on myself. And I like the guilt that you described is real for me.
yeah,
I
that's
have a family, I have 6 children, so I'm like, I'm going to go spend a couple $100 on myself. That's a couple $100 that could go into their college savings
right.
account.
It's true for everybody. As much as, I mean, I'm sure there's probably some people out there that are so narcissistic that they don't care. But for the vast majority of us, we are going to feel that guilt of saying, should I, you know, I really should fix the deck in the back, and do I really want to, go out and buy a new set of golf clubs or whatever it is? No. But when they're just, it's like, hey, this is what I want. I can't, I can't just turn them in. Then that actually drives some motivation. So those are some of the interesting pieces that when we talk with companies around developing out their total rewards, and I always try to approach this from a total rewards, because you use different tools, as we talked about tools of behavioral science, right? You have different tools in your tool belt about how do you motivate people, and you don't just use one tool. You don't hit everything with that hammer of cash. You need to bring in others, and cash is important. I mean, people have to pay their mortgage, they have to put savings aside, and there's important pieces of that, and so you want to make sure that you're paying them well, base salaries there, all of those factors. But then if you're trying to get them to go above and beyond, and again, signaling to them what's important, and then getting them maybe some additional motivational aspects beyond that, those are some of the things that you can look at.
Yeah, and the signaling of pay is a really great point that you make. And I think, given the current pandemic uh, context that we're in, one of the things that strikes me is how some retailers, like grocery stores, they are actually paying their employees more,
Yeah,
um, because it's a heightened time of anxiety and just the work of restocking shelves, and all of that work, to show up in the midst of this public health crisis. Organizations have decided, yeah, we want to signal to our employees that we value them enough that we're going to pay them a couple of extra bucks an hour.
yeah,
Now, at the end of the day, does that couple extra bucks, um, it might make a big difference for some people, but it's more symbolic, you
yeah.
know, than well, the pay matters. Don't get me wrong, but I think it's mostly symbolic. It communicates to their employees that they're appreciated, they're valued, that the employer recognizes these are unique times, and you deserve some sort of acknowledgement for what you're doing.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail right there, because when we think about the additional $2 or $3 that they get for hazard pay during this time, I mean, for some people, again, minimum wage employees, that's a significant amount, and it can make a big difference. But for others, I think that the real value is it shows that the organization understands that these people are going and working in extraordinary times, and that they care about them. And care is a big piece, right? The way that you talk about motivation, one of the theories that I often bring in is this idea of, it's called the 4 Drive model. It's developed by a couple guys from Harvard, Nitin Noria, and then Paul Lawrence. Paul Lawrence has passed away, but Noria, I think, is still the dean of the business college there. But they developed this back in early 2000s. Talks about, the drive to acquire and achieve, which is the money and the tangible stuff, but it's bonding and belonging is the second drive, which is this idea of we're communal people, we're social animals, and so we're driven to have positive social relationships, which is really a powerful thing. There's this drive to challenge and learn, right? We are, you put a challenge out there, we're humans, we go after those challenges, we're motivated to go do that in various different things. But the last one is this drive to defend and define our purpose in various different pieces. And as an organization, one of the best ways that you can tap into that is to show that, hey, we care about you. You are part of our tribe, and as a tribe, we care about you. Again, because again, when you think about the evolutionary, we defend the tribe from outward threats. And so in this time of pandemic, I've seen lots of organizations where that's happened because we round the wagons, and we protect ourselves from those outward threats. And the COVID-19 pandemic, whatever, is one of those threats. And so how do you tap into that? And one of those ways is to definitely show that you care. So.
Yeah, and the socialization piece is so vital. Now, when we're physically together in the workplace, there's a lot of things you can do in you know developing and maintaining a positive company culture and social norms that reinforce that. It's interesting right now because so many people are just working remotely, and I'm wondering what thoughts do you have about how organizational leaders can help, you know, maintain a healthy organizational culture, positive social norms within this new remote work environment?
Yeah, I will. I will. We interviewed Liz Fosslien, who wrote a book on emotions at work, and as part of this, after this COVID thing, and I'm going to steal something from her because she talked about emotionally proofreading your emails. And one of the things that she talked about is that we have these bump-ins when we're in person, right? That you get to a meeting, and the meeting hasn't started yet, and you run into somebody that you haven't seen, and it is in those bump in moments, those moments in the hallway, at lunch, various different things that we often do. Hey, I want to thank you for last week. That email that you sent was just perfect, or you got that project done. Those are the times we often recognize, and we give those accolades. We do the pat on the back kind of things. And in this video chat Zoom world that we're in, email things, we don't tend to take time to do that. We don't have those just bump in moments. And so from a leadership perspective, make sure that you are emotionally reading your emails, and even in your Zoom meetings or whatever, however you get together with different people, is emotionally think about proofreading this, to do those bump in moments, and make those recognition elements salient to the people, and be really focused in on making sure you're touching on their emotions. The idea that um, we go from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, which is I've heard lots of people doing. Or even if you're in the case where you might be running a grocery store, and people are still out there interacting with people, but there's a bunch of emotions that are going on. And if we discount those emotions, if we discount the fact that, hey, people are scared, they have a life, maybe their spouse or partner has lost his or her job, maybe they know somebody who is sick, or maybe their kids are now at home, and it's hard to work in various different pieces. So if you don't address that, if you don't acknowledge that, you're doing a big disservice for your employees, and they're gonna realize that. And you talked about this idea of signaling that the extra hazard pay is a positive signal, that will go a long way. There's also, people will remember the things that you didn't do, that for a long time too. And so once this crisis is over, your retention and loyalty from those people is going to be decreased if you're not acknowledging some of those facets.
That's a great point. And while we've seen some really great examples of organizations stepping up, we've also seen bad examples where they haven't. And I've raised this issue with a few different organizations just recently. And understandably so, they're worried about their budgets.
Yeah.
And I get it. They're trying to keep the doors open. So that's important. But you also have to balance the current immediate dilemma, with long-term ramifications. And that's a hard thing to do. Those are hard decisions to make, no doubt about it.
It is really hard. I've work with a bunch of companies around obviously their incentives and dealing with one pharmaceutical company who is really concerned about we got to get out and sell this, and yet there's this idea of are we being tone deaf not only to our employees, like pushing them to get out and to just sell when this crisis is going on, but also to the physicians that they're going out and trying to sell to. So do you actively sell in this market? At what point does that seem to cross whatever line there is in the sand of saying, yes, we're a business, we need to bring money in order to keep the lights on and do that, versus yeah, you are just crossing a line that you should not be crossing at this point because you're being emotionally tone deaf to what's going on out there in the world. And it's a line that keeps shifting too, I think. And
Yep,
that's the
yep.
hard part for organizations because, hey, 3 weeks ago, that might have been a hard line in the sand. Now it's not. Now maybe you can go out there and do things because things are opening up a little bit more and various different things. So it's a number of facets to that, but I agree with you that it's hard, right, for organizations to come to grips with what they need to be doing and how that shows up.
Yeah. Well, Kurt, it has been wonderful talking with you. We're already to the end of our time. But before we close, I want to give you the chance, if you could just take a minute and let the listeners know how they can get in touch with you and learn more about what you're doing.
Great. Yeah. So you can reach me by email. It's kurt@lanterngroup.com. The website is lanterngroup.com. That's the company, that's the behavioral change and communication agency that we operate. But then if you just want to get more into behavioral science and the application of that to work and life, and more focused on work, typically is Behavioral Grooves is the podcast that I do with my co-host Tim Houlihan, and we interview people from around the globe and talk about how they can take insights from behavioral science and how do you apply that? How do you positively apply that in to make behavior change and to drive performance and to make a positive impact on society and the world? So
Wonderful. Well, I encourage my listeners to reach out to Kurt and learn more about him. And Kurt, it's been a pleasure talking with you. We haven't had enough time. So hopefully we can do this again and have you back on in the future.
well, I appreciate it, John. This has been fun. I geek out about this stuff, so I would be happy to talk with anybody at any point. This is the highlight of my day when I get to talk about this stuff. So thank you for allowing me that opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again. And I hope you have a wonderful week.